Have you ever felt someone slowly pulling away from you, and no matter what you did, you couldn't reach them? You called, you texted, you tried to understand, but the more you moved closer, the more they stepped back. And deep inside, a painful question kept growing louder. If they care, why do they feel so distant? Stay with this until the end, because what you're about to understand can change how you see people, and maybe even how you see yourself. What if the distance you feel is not rejection, but protection? That sounds strange, right? Because everything in you wants to label it as disinterest. Your mind starts creating stories. They don't care. They've lost feelings. I'm not enough. But what if the truth is much deeper than that? What if the silence you're trying to break is the only way they know how to survive something inside them? There are people who don't run from love because they don't want it. They run because love awakens something they don't know how to handle. Something heavy, something overwhelming, something that doesn't feel safe. To you, connection feels natural. You move closer when you care. You open up. You express. You build. But to them, closeness doesn't feel like peace. It feels like pressure, not because of you, but because of what closeness triggers inside them. You see distance. They feel intensity. And that intensity is not always beautiful. It can feel like losing control, like emotions rising too fast, too deep, too much. Imagine feeling something so strongly that instead of moving toward it, your instinct tells you to escape it. Not because it's bad, but because it feels overwhelming. This is the silent world of someone avoidant. They don't wake up one day and decide to be distant. It's not a strategy. It's not a game. It's a pattern that was built slowly over time, often without them even realizing it. A pattern that taught them one dangerous belief. Closeness leads to pain. So when something real starts to grow, when connection becomes deeper, when emotions become stronger, their system reacts. Not with excitement, not with comfort, but with alarm. And that alarm doesn't sound like fear. It sounds like withdrawal. It looks like short replies. It feels like emotional distance. It becomes silence. But here's the part most people never understand. They are not stepping away from you. They are stepping away from what they feel inside themselves. Because what's happening inside them is confusing. It's intense. It's unfamiliar. And instead of facing it, they create space from it. Because space feels safe. Space feels quiet. Space gives them control again. Think about this for a moment. When you feel connected to someone, you want more of it. You lean in, you hold on. You build something stronger. But for them, the same connection can feel like standing too close to something powerful. Something they can't predict. Something that might consume them. So they take a step back, not because you're too much, but because the feeling is too much. And this is where most people misunderstand everything. You see their distance and think, I'm not enough. But the truth is, sometimes you're exactly what they're not ready for. That's a hard truth, a painful one, because it shifts the story. It removes the blame from you, but it also removes the control you thought you had. Because no matter how much you give, no matter how much you try, you cannot force someone to feel safe in something they have learned to fear. And here's something even deeper. They might not even understand this about themselves. From the outside, it looks like they're calm, detached, unbothered. But inside, there can be a quiet storm. Thoughts they can't organize, emotions they can't express, a constant push and pull between wanting connection and needing distance. And that internal conflict is exhausting. So instead of explaining it, they escape it. Instead of saying, I'm overwhelmed, they become unavailable. Instead of saying, I don't know how to handle this, they create space. And you're left trying to decode silence, trying to find meaning in short replies, trying to hold on to something that feels like it's slipping away. But what if the silence was never meant to hurt you? What if it was the only language they knew? In a moment they couldn't control. This doesn't mean their behavior doesn't affect you. It does. It hurts. It confuses. It leaves you questioning your worth. But understanding the why behind it changes everything. Because once you see that their distance is not always rejection, but a reaction, you stop chasing answers in the wrong places. You stop blaming yourself for something you didn't cause. And most importantly, you begin to see the difference between someone who doesn't care and someone who doesn't know how to handle caring. That difference is everything. Because one is absence of feeling, and the other is fear of feeling too much. And when you truly understand that, something shifts inside you. You stop begging for closeness from someone who is fighting closeness within themselves. You stop trying to fix what was never yours to fix. And you start protecting your own emotional space with clarity instead of confusion. Because sometimes the most powerful realization is this. Not everyone who pulls away is trying to leave you. Some are just trying to escape a feeling they don't understand. And until you see that clearly, you will keep chasing people who are not running from you, but from themselves. What if person you're trying to understand has a truth they've never been able to say out loud, not because they want to hide it, but because they don't even know how to put it into words? There is something deeply misunderstood about them. On the surface, they may seem distant, calm, even unaffected. You might look at their behavior and assume there is nothing going on inside, but that assumption is far from reality. Beneath that quiet exterior, there is a world of emotion that doesn't disappear. It just stays unspoken. If they could be completely honest, without fear of being judged or misunderstood, they wouldn't start by saying, "I don't care." They would say, "I feel everything. I just don't know what to do with it." That is where the real struggle begins, because feeling deeply and expressing clearly are not the same thing. Some people experience emotions like a storm without direction. It builds, it intensifies, it becomes overwhelming, but it doesn't come with instructions. There are no clear words attached to it, no easy way to explain it. So instead of expressing it, they hold it inside. And when emotions stay inside for too long, they don't become clear, they become heavier. You might think that if something matters, it should be easy to say. But for them, it's the opposite. The more it matters, the harder it becomes to express. Because once they say it, it becomes real. Once it becomes real, it becomes something they have to face. And facing it feels uncomfortable, sometimes even frightening. So they stay silent not because there is nothing to say, but because there is too much to say. This is the part that creates confusion for others. You might be waiting for reassurance, for clarity, for some kind of emotional response, but what you receive instead is distance, hesitation, or quietness, and it feels like a lack of effort. But the truth is, it's not always a lack of effort. It's a lack of ability to process and communicate at the same time. Imagine trying to explain a feeling you don't fully understand yourself. Imagine being expected to give clarity while your mind is still trying to make sense of what's happening inside. That pressure doesn't help. It makes everything more difficult because now it's not just about feeling something. It's about performing something they are not ready for, and that creates resistance. They begin to feel like they are being pushed into a space they don't feel prepared to handle. Even simple questions can start to feel heavy, not because the questions are wrong, but because the answers are not available yet. So instead of responding with honesty, they respond with avoidance. Not as a way to hurt, but as a way to cope. There is also something else happening beneath the surface. A quiet belief that their emotions might not be accepted if they were fully revealed. A fear that if they say the wrong thing, or if they don't say it perfectly, it could create problems they don't know how to fix. So they wait. They hold back. They choose silence over risk. But silence has a cost because while they are protecting themselves from discomfort, the other person starts feeling uncertainty. That uncertainty turns into doubt too, and doubt slowly turns into emotional distance on both sides. This is how disconnection grows, even when feelings are still present. If they could truly open up, they wouldn't give you a perfect explanation. They wouldn't suddenly become expressive and clear. Instead, they would probably say something simple, something honest, something real. "I don't know how to explain what I feel, but it's there." That sentence alone carries more truth than any forced response because the issue has never been about a lack of emotion. It has always been about the struggle to understand it, organize it, and express it in a way that feels safe. And when someone doesn't feel safe with their own emotions, they cannot easily share them with someone else. This doesn't mean they don't care about the connection. In fact, sometimes the connection is exactly what makes everything more intense. It brings feelings to the surface that were easier to ignore before. It creates a situation where they are forced to confront something they usually avoid, and that confrontation is not easy. It requires a level of emotional awareness they may not have developed yet. It requires patience with themselves. It requires learning a language they were never taught. So instead of expressing clearly, they become quiet. Instead of explaining fully, they withdraw. And you're left trying to interpret what was never clearly said. But once you understand this pattern, something important changes. You stop expecting immediate clarity from someone who is still trying to understand themselves. You stop taking silence as a direct reflection of your worth. And you begin to see that sometimes the most honest truth is not spoken in words, but hidden in behavior that is misunderstood. Because if they truly had the ability to express everything they feel, you wouldn't be questioning their emotions. You would be hearing them clearly. But until that ability is built, their truth remains inside. Not absent, not empty, just unspoken. Have you ever noticed how something that feels warm and comforting to you can feel heavy and overwhelming to someone else? This is where the misunderstanding grows even deeper. Because what you call love, they may experience as pressure. Not the kind of pressure that comes from you trying too hard. Not the kind that comes from expectations you clearly express. It is a different kind. A quiet weight that builds inside them when emotional closeness becomes real. At the beginning, everything feels light. Conversations are easy. There is space. There is no demand to go deeper than what feels manageable. But as time passes, something starts to change. The connection begins to grow. The bond becomes stronger, and slowly, without any warning, that lightness starts to turn into something they struggle to carry. It is not because the connection is wrong. It is because the intensity is unfamiliar. When emotions begin to deepen, most people feel secure. They feel chosen. They feel closer. But for them, deeper connection can feel like stepping into something they cannot control. Like being pulled into a place where expectations, responsibilities, and emotional demands might appear at any moment. And that thought alone creates tension inside them. They start asking themselves questions they don't say out loud. What if I can't give enough? What if I disappoint them? What if this becomes too much for me to handle? These thoughts don't come from logic. They come from fear. A quiet fear that grows stronger as the connection becomes more real. So instead of moving forward with confidence, they begin to slow down. You might notice small changes first. They take longer to respond. They seem less expressive. They pull back just a little. And you start wondering what changed. But nothing external changed. The shift happened inside them. Because as emotions deepen, the situation starts to feel like something they have to manage, maintain, and protect. It no longer feels like something natural. It starts to feel like something that requires effort they are not sure they can sustain. And when something feels like a responsibility instead of a natural flow, it creates pressure. Even if you never asked for anything, even if you never demanded more, the feeling still exists inside them. This is why understanding becomes so important. Because from your perspective, you are simply building something meaningful. You are growing closer. You are investing emotionally. But from their perspective, that same growth can feel like standing under a weight that keeps increasing. Not because you are doing something wrong, but because they don't know how to carry something that feels this deep. And this is where their behavior starts to confuse you even more. They may still care. They may still think about you. They may still feel connected. But at the same time, they start creating distance. It looks like contradiction, but it is actually conflict. A conflict between wanting connection and feeling overwhelmed by it. And when that conflict becomes too strong, they look for relief. That relief often comes in the form of space. Because space reduces intensity. Space gives them a sense of control again. Space makes everything feel lighter, even if only for a moment. So they step back. Not because the connection lost value, but because it became too heavy for them to process. And this is where many people take it personally. You might think, if they really cared, it wouldn't feel like this. But care and capacity are not the same thing. Someone can feel deeply and still not have the emotional capacity to handle what they feel. That is the truth most people struggle to accept. Because it challenges the idea that love should always be simple, clear, and easy to express. But for some people, love activates fears instead of comfort. It brings uncertainty instead of stability. It creates questions instead of answers. And those questions don't just disappear. They stay in the background, influencing every action, every reaction, every decision to move closer or further away. If they could explain this honestly, they wouldn't blame you. They wouldn't say you asked for too much. They wouldn't say you did something wrong. They would say something much more difficult to admit. This feels important to me. And that scares me. Because importance brings responsibility. Responsibility brings pressure. And pressure brings fear of failure. So instead of risking that failure, they try to reduce the pressure. And the only way they know how to do that is by creating distance. This doesn't mean the connection is not real. It means the experience of that connection is different for them. Where you feel comfort, they may feel tension. Where you feel certainty, they may feel doubt. Where you feel closer, they may feel overwhelmed. And unless you understand this difference, everything they do will feel confusing because you will be measuring their actions based on your emotional experience, not theirs. But once you see this clearly, something changes inside you. You stop assuming that closeness feels the same for everyone. You stop expecting someone to respond the way you would, and you begin to understand that sometimes what feels natural to you can feel like pressure to someone else. Not because of who you are, but because of what they carry inside. Have you ever felt like getting closer to someone meant you might lose a part of yourself? For some people, this fear is not small. It is not temporary. It sits deep inside them, shaping how they respond to every emotional bond they experience. And when something meaningful begins to grow, this fear does not disappear. It becomes stronger. Because connection to them is not only about being with someone else, it is also about what they might have to give up in the process. At first, everything feels manageable. There is space to be themselves. There is no pressure to change, no sense of being absorbed into something larger. But as the bond strengthens, a quiet thought begins to rise inside them. What if I lose control of my own space? This thought does not come from reality. It comes from perception. A perception that being close to someone might slowly take away their independence. That caring deeply might mean adjusting, compromising, or becoming someone they are not ready to become. So instead of seeing connection as something that adds to their life, they start seeing it as something that might take something away. And that changes everything, because once a person starts to feel like they might lose themselves, their instinct is not to move closer. Their instinct is to protect what feels at risk. They begin to guard their time. They become careful with their emotions. They create invisible boundaries without explaining them. Not because the other person is demanding too much, but because their mind is preparing for a loss that has not even happened. This is where their actions can feel confusing again. You might feel like you are simply trying to build something meaningful. You are showing care. You are offering presence. But they might experience that same effort as something that slowly reduces their sense of freedom. It is not logical, but it is real for them. Because their fear is not about you controlling them. It is about the possibility of losing control of themselves. And once that fear becomes active, everything starts to feel different. Simple moments can begin to feel heavy. Normal expectations can start to feel like pressure. Even emotional closeness can feel like something that needs to be managed carefully. So they begin to pull back, not from the person, but from the feeling of being overwhelmed by the situation. This is why they may seem distant, even when nothing has gone wrong. Because the shift is happening inside their perception. They are not reacting to what is happening. They are reacting to what they believe might happen, and that belief creates tension. They start thinking ahead, imagining scenarios where they lose control, where they become too involved, where they cannot maintain their sense of self. And instead of waiting to see if those fears are true, they act early. They create distance before the fear becomes reality. This gives them a sense of safety. It allows them to feel like they are still in control of their own space, their own identity, their own emotions. But from the outside, it does not look like self-protection. It looks like withdrawal. And that is where the misunderstanding continues. Because you might interpret their distance as a sign that they are losing interest. But the truth is, sometimes they step back because the connection is becoming too significant, not because it is losing meaning. If they could explain this clearly, they would not say, "I don't want this." They would say, "I am afraid of losing myself in this." That is a very different truth. It is not about rejecting the connection. It is about trying to maintain a sense of identity within it. But here is the challenge. When someone is focused on protecting their sense of self, they may struggle to balance closeness with independence. They may feel like they have to choose one over the other, so they choose distance. Because distance feels like control. Distance feels like safety. Distance feels like a way to stay grounded in who they are. But at the same time, this choice creates another problem. Because while they are protecting themselves, they are also creating emotional space that can be felt by the other person. And that space can slowly turn into disconnection. Not because the bond was not real, but because the fear was stronger than their ability to manage it. This is why understanding this fear is so important. Because it shows you that their behavior is not always about losing interest or not caring. Sometimes it is about trying to hold on to themselves while being part of something that feels bigger than they are used to. And that is not an easy balance to maintain, especially for someone who has learned to rely on their independence as a form of safety. So when they feel like that independence might be affected, they react. Not with explanation, not with clarity, but with distance. And unless you see the fear behind that distance, you will continue to misunderstand their actions. Because you will be looking at what they do instead of understanding what they are trying to protect. And what they are trying to protect is not the absence of connection. It is the presence of themselves.